Ngozi never thought her life would turn so painful in just one night. During a big family celebration in Lagos, the music was loud, the neighbors had gathered, and everyone was laughing. But suddenly her husband's voice cut through the crowd. In front of everyone, he shouted at her, called her a burden, and told her to leave his house. Before Ngozi could even understand, her clothes and little belongings were thrown out onto the street. Neighbors whispered and laughed. Children pointed, women shook their heads, and men mocked her. With tears in her eyes, Ngozi stood outside the mansion, humiliated, her heart breaking as people called her the unwanted wife. That night she slept in silence, holding back her pain, while her husband and in-laws celebrated inside without shame. But the next morning, everything changed. The family lawyer arrived, carrying important documents. In front of the same neighbors who had mocked her, he cleared his throat and read the truth. The mansion everyone believed belonged to Ngozi's husband was never his. The real owner, according to the official papers, was Ngozi herself. The crowd gasped in shock, mouths wide open. Her husband's proud face turned pale, and his family's laughter froze instantly. Neighbors who had mocked her just hours before began clapping and congratulating her. Some even shouted, "God bless you, Ngozi." Ngozi walked back into the mansion, her head held high, her tears now turning into a smile. The same house where she was thrown out became her victory. The same people who laughed at her now cheered for her. That day, the whole street learned an unforgettable lesson. Never humiliate someone, because tables can turn in the blink of an eye. Aking had lived with her husband's family in Nairobi for years, quietly serving, cooking, and taking care of everyone. She never complained, even when she was treated as if she didn't matter. But one morning, everything changed. Her husband, with his mother by his side, shouted at her in the courtyard. In front of neighbors passing by, he called her useless, a woman with no value. Before she could defend herself, her clothes, shoes, and small belongings were thrown into the street. People at the market nearby stopped to watch. Some whispered, some laughed, and others shook their heads in pity. Aking stood there, humiliated, her eyes filled with tears as her life was being destroyed in public. She felt the heavy sting of shame as even children giggled and pointed. For days, she stayed quiet, keeping her pain hidden. She moved into a small friend's house, but her heart was heavy. She remembered the way her husband had smiled with pride as he declared, "This house will never belong to you. You are nothing here." Those words burned in her soul. Still, she stayed calm, because she knew something her husband didn't. She held on to a secret, waiting for the right moment. That moment came when the community elders called for a hearing. Everyone gathered in the open square, neighbors, family members, and market women who had witnessed her humiliation. Her husband walked in with confidence, mocking her even in front of the elders. He claimed the house was his family's legacy, and that Aking had no right to it. The crowd nodded, believing his words. Aking stood quietly, her hands trembling, but her eyes were steady. Then, slowly, she pulled out a brown envelope. Inside was the official title deed, signed and stamped, clearly declaring her as the rightful owner of the mansion. The elders examined the paper, their eyes widening in shock. One of them read it aloud so that the whole crowd could hear. A silence fell over the market. Then gasps filled the air. Women covered their mouths in disbelief, men shook their heads, and children whispered, "It's hers." The same neighbors who had mocked her days ago now clapped and cheered. Some shouted, "Congratulations, Aking." Others said, "God does not sleep." Her husband's face turned dark, his pride shattered. His mother's knees gave way as she sat down in shock. The elders turned to him with disappointment, calling his actions shameful. The once loud man now had no voice. Aking stood tall, her tears now tears of victory. She walked through the crowd as people reached out to bless her. She was no longer the humiliated woman pushed into the street. She was the respected owner of the home. The house that had once thrown her out was now her crown of dignity. That day, the whole community learned a lesson they would never forget. Never laugh at someone's pain, because God can lift them higher than anyone ever imagined. Abina had dressed beautifully for her cousin's wedding in Accra. She wore a bright Kent dress, her smile shining even though her heart was heavy. For months her husband's family had treated her coldly, whispering behind her back that she was after their wealth. She ignored the gossip, hoping that one day they would see her true heart. But that day turned into her worst humiliation. In the middle of the wedding celebration, while guests were laughing and dancing, Abina's husband suddenly stood up. His voice echoed across the hall. In front of everyone, he pointed at her and called her a gold digger. He said she married him only for money, and that she had no place in their family mansion. Laughter spread through the crowd, and whispers grew louder. Some guests shook their heads, others looked at her with pity. Abina felt her face burn with shame as tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to disappear, but she stood still, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress. Her cousin, the bride, looked away nervously, afraid of the drama ruining her day. But just as Abina thought her dignity was gone forever, the moment turned around. The officiating lawyer, who was present for a special family announcement after the wedding, stepped forward. He carried a folder with the late father-in-law's will. The crowd quieted down, curious. The lawyer's voice was calm but firm as he read the words. The family mansion, the very house her husband claimed as his pride, was left entirely to Abina. It was written clearly, signed and sealed by the late father-in-law himself. Gasps filled the hall. Guests leaned forward, whispering in shock. Some clapped their hands in amazement, others shouted, "God is good!" The same people who had mocked Abina moments ago now congratulated her loudly. Women ululated in celebration, their voices filling the hall. Her husband's face went pale. His proud body shook, and before anyone could help him, he collapsed into his chair in shame. His mother cried out, holding her head in disbelief. The same man who had humiliated his wife was now the one drowning in disgrace. Abina wiped her tears and stood taller than ever before. The smile returned to her face, brighter this time, filled with strength. She was no longer the woman accused of being a gold digger. She was the rightful owner of the mansion, chosen and honored by her late father-in-law. Guests surrounded her, blessing her, congratulating her, telling her she was truly favored. That day, at a wedding meant for another, Abina received her own crown of victory. The woman once mocked in public walked out with her head high, while those who insulted her lowered their eyes in shame. The story spread across Accra like wildfire. Never disgrace a woman, because God may already be writing her greatest victory. Jeanette never forgot that cold night in Kigali. It was past midnight, and heavy rain poured down as thunder rolled across the sky. She was asleep when her husband suddenly shook her awake, shouting angrily. Without mercy, he dragged her out of bed and ordered her to leave the mansion at once. She begged him to calm down, her voice breaking, but he pushed her toward the door. Her small bag of clothes was thrown into her arms as if she were a stranger. Standing barefoot in the rain, Jeanette's tears mixed with the water streaming down her face. Neighbors peeked from their windows, watching silently as her husband slammed the door shut. She stood there shivering, her heart breaking. This was the home she had built her dreams around, the place where she believed her family would grow in love. But now she was left outside, unwanted and humiliated, in the middle of the night. As she walked away, she heard her husband's proud voice from inside the house, boasting to his relatives. He laughed loudly, saying he would sell the mansion soon and make a fortune without her. Every word stabbed her heart like a knife. But Jeanette was not as powerless as they thought. She carried with her a secret, one that even her husband didn't know. She had legal documents connected to the house. Still, she stayed calm, waiting for the right moment. The very next morning, the truth came out. Her husband had rushed to the bank, bragging that he wanted to discuss selling the property. He walked in confidently, expecting to be treated like the rightful owner. But instead, the bank officers pulled out the official records. With serious faces, they told him the truth. The mansion was not his. According to all legal documents, the only rightful owner was Jeanette. His smile faded instantly, and his legs grew weak. People in the bank began whispering as his disgrace became clear. Jeanette arrived soon after, holding her head high despite the pain of last night. When the officers handed her the ownership papers, the crowd clapped in surprise. Some congratulated her warmly, saying, "You are blessed, Jeanette." Others shook their heads at her husband, calling him shameful. The man who had thrown his wife out into the rain now stood humiliated in broad daylight. Jeanette's tears returned, but this time they were tears of joy. She walked back to the mansion with dignity, her neighbors watching in awe. The same house where she was abandoned at midnight now welcomed her as its true queen. Her husband, silenced and disgraced, could not stop her. That day, the whole community learned a powerful lesson. Never mistreat a woman who has done nothing but love, because the very stone you reject may turn out to be the foundation of everything. Jeanette's story spread across Kigali as a tale of justice and triumph, and people celebrated her victory with heartfelt congratulations. The sun was shining brightly over Mombasa as the annual festival filled the streets with music, dancing, and laughter. People wore colorful clothes, drums echoed, and children ran happily with sweets in their hands. Zuri walked with quiet grace, enjoying the celebration, though deep inside she always carried the heavy weight of how her husband's family treated her. They had never accepted her and always whispered that she did not belong. That afternoon, as the crowd gathered for the main parade, her husband and his relatives stood on a stage. Suddenly, in front of hundreds of neighbors, he raised his voice and pointed at Zuri. He called her useless and said loudly, "This woman has no place in our mansion. She is nothing but a burden." His words cut through the music like a knife. The crowd gasped, then laughter spread among some people. Women whispered, men chuckled, and children pointed at her. Zuri's heart pounded with pain. Her face burned with shame, and her eyes filled with tears. She wanted the ground to open and swallow her. The festival, which had been a day of joy, became her moment of deepest humiliation. But destiny was already preparing a surprise. Later that evening, when the festival reached its end, government officials arrived to make an important public announcement. The same crowd gathered again, curious and excited. Among them stood Zuri, still holding back tears, while her husband smirked with pride, certain that he had destroyed her dignity forever. One official stepped forward with a file in his hand. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. The mansion, the very one that her husband's family claimed with so much pride, was not in their name at all. According to the official land records, the property legally belonged to Zuri. The words echoed across the festival ground, and silence fell for a moment. Then came the gasps, the murmurs, and the cries of surprise. Her husband's smile vanished. His proud shoulders slumped as neighbors turned to look at him with judgment. The very same people who had laughed at Zuri only hours before now burst into applause. Women cheered, men clapped, and children shouted her name. "Congratulations, Zuri!" Voices rose all around her. Some even began to dance, celebrating her victory as if it were their own. Zuri stood frozen, tears streaming down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. She raised her hands in gratitude, her heart finally free from the pain of rejection. That evening, the woman who had been mocked publicly was celebrated more loudly than the festival drums themselves. Her dignity returned, her name honored, and her enemies silenced. The story spread quickly across Mombasa. People kept repeating it for weeks. The woman they humiliated is the true owner. And everywhere she went, Zuri was greeted with blessings and congratulations. Her humiliation turned into a crown of glory, proving that no one can take away what is truly meant for you. Naledi had always tried to be a good wife and daughter-in-law in Johannesburg. She cooked, cleaned, and respected her husband's family, even when her mother-in-law treated her like an outsider. No matter what she did, the older woman never accepted her. "You only married my son for money," she would whisper loudly, making sure Naledi heard. Naledi stayed silent, holding on to her dignity. One afternoon, everything boiled over. Her mother-in-law shouted in the living room, demanding that Naledi leave the mansion. Her husband, instead of protecting her, joined in. In front of relatives and neighbors, he accused her of being a gold digger. He dragged her belongings out of the house while his mother stood proudly, watching with a cruel smile. Naledi's heart broke as the people she loved turned against her. She cried quietly, feeling the sting of betrayal. Neighbors whispered, "She has lost everything." Children pointed, and her dignity seemed shattered forever. But Naledi carried something no one else knew. Months earlier, her late father-in-law had given her a sealed envelope, asking her to keep it safe. She never opened it because she respected his trust. That night, broken and alone, she finally took it out and read it. Inside was a letter that made her tremble with shock. Her father-in-law, the true head of the family, had written with his own hand that the mansion must belong to Naledi. He had seen her kindness, her patience, and her pure heart, and he wanted her to be protected even after his death. The letter was signed and witnessed, making it legally strong. The next day, she gathered her courage and went to the family meeting where her husband and mother-in-law continued to mock her. In front of everyone, Naledi opened the letter and handed it to the lawyer. The lawyer read it aloud, his voice firm and clear. The words echoed through the room. The mansion was Naledi's. Gasps filled the air. Relatives who had laughed at her stared in shock. Neighbors who had pitied her began clapping and shouting, "Congratulations, Naledi." Women ululated in joy, their voices rising like music. Her husband's proud face turned pale as he looked at the floor, too ashamed to meet her eyes. But the greatest shock fell on her mother-in-law. The moment the truth was confirmed, the old woman clutched her chest and collapsed into her chair, unable to believe that the mansion she thought was hers had slipped from her hand. Naledi stood tall, her tears flowing freely, but this time from joy. The same people who had seen her thrown out now celebrated her as the true owner. She walked back into the mansion with her head high, greeted with blessings and congratulations from the community. Her story spread quickly across Johannesburg, teaching everyone a powerful lesson. Greed and cruelty can never defeat truth. The woman they tried to destroy became the woman they had to honor, and Naledi's victory was remembered as one of the greatest turns of fate. Miriam had built her whole life around her marriage in Kampala. She worked hard, supported her husband, and poured her heart into making their mansion a true home. But one morning, her world was shaken. Her husband handed her a set of papers and, with a cold smile, told her that their marriage was over. Miriam's hands trembled as she read the words. They looked like official divorce papers, stamped and signed. Shocked and heartbroken, she begged him to explain, but he only shouted that she had no right to stay in the house anymore. Within hours, her belongings were thrown outside, and she was left standing in the street, humiliated and broken. Neighbors watched in silence, some whispering, others laughing at her misfortune. As Miriam cried quietly, Her husband bragged loudly to his relatives and friends. He boasted that he was now the sole owner of the mansion and would enjoy his life without her. He walked around the neighborhood with pride, telling everyone that he had gotten rid of a burden. People shook their heads, some pitying Miriam, others believing his lies. But deep in her heart, Miriam knew something was not right. She held on to a hope that truth would come to light. Days later, Miriam decided to take the matter to court. She gathered all her strength and presented the so-called divorce papers to a lawyer. After reviewing them carefully, the lawyer confirmed her suspicion. The documents were fake. Her husband had forged them to trick her, hoping to steal the mansion for himself. Miriam's pain now turned into determination. She collected every legal document she had, including the original title deed that showed her as the rightful owner. When the court day arrived, the room was filled with people, curious to hear the outcome. Her husband entered confidently, smirking, and boasting to anyone who would listen that he had already won. He expected the judge to dismiss Miriam immediately. But when it was her turn, Miriam stood tall, her voice calm yet firm. She handed over the real documents, each one stamped and legal. The courtroom grew silent as the judge carefully examined the papers. Then, with a stern voice, the judge declared the truth. The mansion did not belong to the husband at all. The rightful owner was Miriam. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some people clapped, others cheered. "Congratulations, Miriam," voices rang. Her husband's face turned pale, his arrogance melting into shame. The judge went further, ruling that because of his lies and cruelty, he would lose all rights to the property. Everything he had tried to steal was stripped away in front of everyone. Miriam's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of victory. She walked out of the courtroom with her head high, greeted by neighbors and strangers who blessed her and celebrated her strength. The man who once bragged about keeping everything was left with nothing. Her story spread across Kampala like wildfire, teaching everyone that lies and deceit may win for a moment, but truth always shines in the end. Miriam became a symbol of courage, and her victory was remembered with joy and admiration. Amina had always been a hardworking woman in Dar es Salaam. She helped her husband with his business, handled finances carefully, and supported him when times were hard. Many of his investors even admired her for her intelligence and honesty. But her husband never gave her the respect she deserved. One day, in front of his business partners, he turned against her. He accused her of mismanaging money and blamed her for the company's struggles. His voice was loud and filled with pride as he pointed at her, saying she was a failure. Before Amina could defend herself, he threw her out of the mansion, telling everyone she was no longer part of his life. The humiliation was deep. Neighbors watched as she carried her belongings, and whispers spread quickly. Some people shook their heads with pity, while others laughed and believed the husband's story. Her heart ached, not only because she had lost her home, but also because the man she had sacrificed for had betrayed her in such a public way. That same evening, her husband gathered his investors at the mansion. He boasted proudly, claiming he had removed the problem from his life and was ready to grow the business without her. He raised his glass, expecting applause and admiration. But Amina was not defeated. She had something powerful in her hands. Legal documents her husband had completely forgotten about. She had kept them safe for years, knowing their value. These documents proved that the mansion, the pride of her husband's life, was not his at all. It was registered in her name. With courage in her heart, she decided it was time to reveal the truth. The next day, as the investors gathered again to discuss business plans, Amina walked into the room. Everyone turned in surprise. Her husband smirked, ready to insult her once more. But before he could speak, Amina placed the documents on the table. The investors leaned in, and the truth became clear. The official papers showed her as the sole owner of the mansion. Gasps filled the room. The very house her husband had been bragging about was never his. It belonged to Amina. The investors exchanged looks of disappointment and anger. One by one, they stood up and told the husband they could no longer trust him. His lies had destroyed his credibility. Instead, they turned to Amina, congratulating her and praising her strength. Some even offered to work with her directly, saying she was the one with true vision and integrity. Her husband's face turned pale, his arrogance collapsing into shame. Amina held her head high as the room filled with applause. Neighbors who had mocked her before now came to her with blessings. She walked back into her mansion not as a rejected wife, but as a respected owner and leader. Her story spread through Dar es Salaam like wildfire. People admired her courage and said, "Look how truth always rises." The woman who was thrown out in disgrace became the woman celebrated with honor, while the man who betrayed her lost everything. Amina's victory became a lesson for all. Never underestimate the strength of a woman who knows her worth. The house in Lusaka was filled with joy and laughter as friends and family gathered for Zaniel's baby shower. Bright decorations covered the walls, music played, and women clapped and danced as they blessed the soon-to-be mother. Zaniel, glowing in her dress, smiled shyly as gifts piled up around her. For the first time in many months, she felt surrounded by love. But that happiness didn't last. In the middle of the celebration, her husband suddenly stood up. With a cold, proud voice, he looked at Zaniel in front of all the guests and declared that once the baby was born, she would no longer live in the mansion. "This house is mine, not yours," he said loudly. "You are only here because of me, and soon you will be gone." His words cut through the music, silencing the crowd. Guests gasped, some covered their mouths in shock, and others whispered in disbelief. Zaniel's smile faded, her eyes filling with tears as she held her stomach protectively. The celebration turned into a moment of deep humiliation. Women shook their heads, saying, "How can he disgrace her like this?" Her husband, however, stood proudly, thinking he had proven his power. He bragged to his friends, saying she was only after his wealth. Laughter echoed from a few corners of the room, while Zaniel sat quietly, tears streaming down her face. But little did anyone know that the truth was about to turn everything upside down. Later that evening, the family lawyer, who had been invited to make a special announcement on behalf of the late father-in-law, stepped forward. He carried a file and cleared his throat. The room grew silent, everyone curious. The lawyer began to read from the official documents. The mansion, the very house her husband had just boasted about, was never his. According to the will, it belonged entirely to Zaniel. The hall erupted in shock. Some guests gasped so loudly that others turned to look at them. Then, slowly, clapping began, building into cheers. Women ululated in excitement, shouting, "Congratulations, Zaniel!" The same crowd that had just pitied her now surrounded her with joy, blessing her and hugging her tightly. Her husband's proud face turned pale. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His friends looked at him with disgust, some shaking their heads, others walking away in silence. The man who had humiliated his wife in front of everyone was now the one drowning in shame. Zaniel wiped her tears and stood tall. The humiliation of earlier had turned into a moment of triumph. She smiled again, this time brighter and stronger, as people clapped and danced around her. The baby shower that began with pain ended in celebration greater than anyone had expected. Her story spread across Lusaka, told again and again as a lesson. Never disgrace a woman who has done nothing but love, because the same crowd that laughs at her pain may one day cheer for her victory. Zaniel became a symbol of strength, and her name was remembered with blessings everywhere she went. The day of the funeral in Dakar was heavy with sorrow. Aminata dressed in black, mourning the man who had always shown her kindness, her father-in-law. But while she tried to grieve in peace, her in-laws turned against her. Right there at the graveside, whispers grew louder until her husband's relatives openly told her to leave the mansion. "You have no place here anymore," one of them said sharply. Others nodded, their faces filled with anger and pride. Tears rolled down Aminata's cheeks as the crowd looked on. She felt humiliated, abandoned on a day meant for mourning. That evening, the family gathered with the lawyer for the will reading. Aminata sat quietly at the back, her heart heavy. Her husband's family smirked confidently, already planning to take over the mansion. The lawyer opened the file and began to read slowly. Then came the shocking words that silenced the room. The mansion, the pride of the family, was not left to the sons or daughters. It was given to Aminata. Gasps filled the room. Some relatives held their heads in disbelief. Others whispered in shame. The same people who had mocked her hours earlier could not even lift their eyes to look at her. Aminata's tears now turned into tears of relief. Neighbors and friends who had gathered congratulated her warmly, saying, "You are blessed." Her husband's family sat in silence, their pride crushed. Aminata walked out of the room with her head high, no longer the woman they tried to throw away, but the rightful owner of the mansion. The story spread quickly across Dakar, and people praised her victory. What began as humiliation at a funeral ended with her greatest triumph.